On the 29th of July in the year 1600, Munich's central square awoke to a horrifying scene that would be remembered in whispers for generations. The stone-paved plaza, usually a place for announcements and markets, was now transformed into a macabre theater. Instruments of torture gleamed under the morning sun. Heated pincers, wheels, iron stakes, and sharpened blades all arranged with methodical precision. But this was no ordinary execution. It was the state-sanctioned destruction of an entire family, the Papenheimers, accused of crimes so heinous, they defied belief. They were to be punished not for proven guilt but for being the perfect scapegoats in a society consumed by religious hysteria. To understand how the Papenheimers reached this tragic fate, we must rewind the story to the year 1596. Bavaria, during this period, was engulfed in the fires of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Religious paranoia ruled daily life. Duke Maximilian I had recently ascended to power and was determined to purify the duchy of heresy, vice, and witchcraft. In his eyes and the eyes of the Church, the presence of unclean souls was the cause of every misfortune, from disease to drought. This paved the way for witch hunts that would become both a moral crusade and a political strategy. In this storm of fear lived Paulus Papenheimer and his family. He was a latrine cleaner, the most despised of professions. He, his wife Anna, and their 3 children, 21-year-old Gumprecht, and 2 10-year-old sons Michel and Hansel, lived a wandering life, sleeping in stables and barns, doing whatever work they could find. They were vagrants, and in that era, that was enough to draw suspicion. The smell of waste that clung to them from Paulus's job became a metaphor. They were seen as human waste. They had no land, no home, and no protector. Society viewed them as undesirables. For years, the Papenheimers traveled from town to town in Bavaria. Occasionally, they were accused of minor thefts, a loaf of bread missing, a chicken gone. But no serious punishment followed. They were merely whispered about. However, this changed drastically in 1599 when a local priest accused them of stealing sacred objects from a church. This accusation, unfounded as it was, gave local authorities the perfect chance to make an example. They were arrested, shackled, and taken to Munich for interrogation. Under the brutal mechanisms of torture, Paulus confessed. But his confession wasn't just to the theft. It soon expanded into tales of murder, witchcraft, desecration of graves, and attending satanic rituals. Each new session of torture produced more evidence, more fabricated crimes. The interrogators had a goal: to paint the Papenheimers as a family deeply allied with the devil. And with enough pain, they succeeded. Anna Papenheimer confessed to causing crop failures and killing livestock through spells. Gumprecht, the eldest son, admitted to assisting in murders. Even the 2 10-year-old boys were tortured until they confessed to aiding their parents in these imagined crimes. By early 1600, the Papenheimer family had been held in dungeon cells for over 6 months. The conditions were hellish. They were fed stale bread and water. Sleep deprivation was used to break their sanity. Their cells were damp, cold, and rat-infested. Their captors would enter at odd hours, shake them awake, and read out new accusations. It was all part of the psychological warfare used in these witch trials. The torment was systematic. Instruments of torture were displayed, and their function described in chilling detail. Paulus and Anna would often confess just to stop the threats. The confessions, of course, were nonsensical. They claimed to have killed over 400 people, an impossible number. Some crimes allegedly occurred in regions the family had never visited. Historical travel records proved the family was in other towns at the time. But no one cared. Under pressure from Duke Maximilian, the court of Munich moved forward. The Papenheimer case was the perfect opportunity to showcase the Duke's religious dedication. Witnesses were coerced. Evidence was forged. The trial was held, but there was no defense. In cases of witchcraft, confession alone was evidence enough. The verdict was unanimous: death by public torture and execution for the entire family. Preparations for the execution were made days in advance. The city square was transformed into a ceremonial ground. Platforms were built. Execution tools were polished. Thousands gathered on the morning of July 29, 1600. Vendors sold bread and ale as if it were a festival. Parents brought children to witness what they believed was God's justice. The crowd waited in eager silence as the Papenheimers were dragged out, bloody, broken, and barefoot. The tortures began. Paulus was stripped and subjected to fleshing, a technique where red-hot pincers were used to rip pieces of flesh from his body. He remained alive and conscious through most of it, screaming as the executioners slowly worked up his torso. Anna was tortured next. Her breasts sliced with heated knives before she was tied to the breaking wheel, where her limbs were smashed with iron bars until the bones splintered. Her screams pierced the heavy morning air. Gumprecht, the eldest son, was forced to watch his parents being tortured before being lashed and beaten. The two young sons, Michel and Hansel, were not spared either. Although their torture was less severe, it involved beatings, iron pins, and being forced to confess to crimes they never understood. The final act was fire. The entire family, their bodies mangled and broken, was tied to wooden stakes in the center of the square. The pyres were lit slowly. The wood was damp, to prolong the burning. Smoke rose first, then fire. Paulus, who was still alive and barely breathing, was the last to die. His body twitched in the flames. His final scream echoed across the square before his skull cracked in the fire. The crowd, some praying, some weeping, and others cheering, watched until nothing remained but ash. What makes the Papenheimer case more terrifying than just its brutality is the precision with which it was executed. It was not the act of spontaneous mob violence but a state-orchestrated ritual of death. The Duke got his propaganda victory. The church was satisfied. The crowd was fed. But history was stained forever. The family's belongings, whatever little they had, were confiscated by the state. This became a common practice in the coming years. Accuse someone of witchcraft, extract a confession through torture, then seize their property. The Papenheimer execution became the first in a long line of similar witch trials across Bavaria. Between 1600 and 1650, hundreds of men, women, and even children were executed in nearly identical ways. Most were poor, homeless, or otherwise vulnerable. The judicial system became a weapon of fear. Torture manuals were written and circulated, instructing interrogators how to maximize pain without immediately killing the accused. Techniques were standardized, and in many cases, the charges made no logical sense. The accused were often documented to be in other towns, but their denials were dismissed. Truth no longer mattered. Pain produced confessions. That was enough. The Papenheimer case was largely buried in public memory. No monument was ever built for them in Munich. No plaque marks the location in the square where they burned. Today, it is a shopping area, busy, loud, and unaware of the blood that once soaked the cobblestones. But scholars would later rediscover the documents. In the 19th and 20th centuries, historians exposed the political manipulation behind the trial, the lack of real evidence, and the sheer impossibility of the families' confessed crimes. Today, the Papenheimers are seen not as criminals but as one of the most tragic examples of a society lost to fear. Their story is not just about torture and injustice. It is about how entire systems can become evil when they surrender reason to zealotry. It is a warning, a reminder. Justice without truth is nothing but cruelty in disguise. And when society begins to see its most vulnerable members as threats, it stands on the edge of collapse. More than 400 years later, the flames that consumed the Papenheimers still flicker in our collective history. And we must remember, not to glorify the horror, but to ensure it never happens again. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.